The ledger was smaller than a hymnal, bound in oilcloth that smelled of kerosene and sweat. Ruthie Carter held it against her ribs as she climbed the wooden steps to the schoolhouse stage on the morning of April 9th, 1907, while 83 people watched from folding chairs and 27 more stood along the back wall. Outside, ice still clung to the eaves despite the calendar promising spring. The men at the rear doors wore deputy badges pinned to wool coats. The men in the fourth row wore lodge rings that caught the lamplight. Ruthie opened the ledger to a page covered in her own small handwriting and began to read names aloud, each one paired with a vehicle registration number and a date. By the time she reached the seventh name, someone in the middle of the room stood abruptly, chair scraping against pine. By the 12th name, a pistol cleared leather, and by nightfall, the county courthouse would be lit like a bonfire while editors set type that would end careers, break families, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon a black woman could carry was a list written in perfect penmanship. Lakewood Colored School sat 3 miles northeast of Portage City, Michigan, on a dirt road that turned to boot-sucking mud every thaw. The building was a single-room frame structure painted white in 1903 and never repainted. So by April of 1907, the clapboards showed bare wood in patches like scars on old skin. Ruthie Carter had been principal and sole teacher there for 4 years, a position she secured through a combination of a teaching certificate from Oberlin College and the fact that no white educator wanted to manage 47 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old in a building with 1 wood stove and no indoor plumbing. The school served families from a 5-mile radius, most of them employed at the foundry in Portage City or working seasonal farm labor. The student population swelled in winter when field work dried up and shrank in planting season, when even children's hands were needed to meet quotas. Ruthie kept attendance records in a bound notebook, marking absences with a small notation about the reason: illness, work, weather, fear. That last category had appeared with increasing frequency since the previous autumn. Portage City itself was a town of 9,000 souls, built around the intersection of 2 rail lines and sustained by lumber mills, a brass foundry, and the commercial traffic moving between Chicago and Detroit. The population was predominantly white, German, and Polish immigrants who had arrived in waves over the past 30 years, along with smaller communities of Irish, Finns, and roughly 400 black families concentrated in a neighborhood locals called the Flats. Relations between communities were governed by an unspoken code that kept employment, housing, and social life rigidly separated. Black workers could labor in the foundry, but could not join the union. Black customers could purchase goods downtown, but only during certain hours. Black children attended Lakewood School, while white children attended one of 3 larger, better-funded institutions within city limits. This arrangement had persisted with minimal friction until the summer of 1906, when the foundry began hiring black workers to replace white employees who had gone on strike for higher wages. The strike collapsed after 6 weeks, when management made it clear the replacement workers were permanent. Resentment calcified into rage. By autumn, a chapter of the Knights of the White Camellia had established itself in Portage City, meeting in the back room of Muller's Hardware on 2nd Street. The Knights claimed lineage from the original Ku Klux Klan and adopted similar regalia, similar rituals, and similar methods of enforcement. Their first public action came on October 14, 1906. A cross burned in the yard of Samuel Hayes, a foundry worker who had taken a foreman position previously held by a German immigrant named Otto Schreiber. The fire was visible from 6 blocks away. No one called the fire brigade. The police arrived an hour after the cross had burned to ash and filed a report noting vandalism of unknown origin. Samuel Hayes moved his family to Cleveland 3 days later. The second incident occurred November 3rd. Marcus Webb, who owned a small grocery in the Flats, found his storefront windows shattered and a note nailed to the doorframe with a bayonet. "Go back to your place, or we will place you in the ground." Marcus owned the building outright, having purchased it with savings accumulated over 20 years. He boarded the windows, reopened the next morning, and kept a shotgun under the counter. The Knights left him alone after that, but the message had been received by others. By December, 14 black families had left Portage City. By February, enrollment at Lakewood School had dropped from 61 students to 47. Parents who kept their children attending did so with visible anxiety, walking them to and from the schoolhouse in groups, varying routes, watching the tree line. Ruthie began arriving an hour before class to check the building for tampering, and staying an hour afterward to walk home children whose parents worked late shifts. She carried a classroom pointer that doubled as a walking stick and kept her eyes on the horizon. The Knights grew bolder. March meetings drew 60 men. They paraded through downtown on the evening of March 16th, robes and hoods visible in the gaslight, passing City Hall without police interference. The newspaper ran a photograph with the caption, "Local civic organization demonstrates community values." No names were printed. No memberships were disclosed. The Knights operated in the gap between law and custom, protected by the silence of neighbors who either supported their aims or feared becoming targets themselves. Ruthie watched all of this with the careful attention of someone whose survival had always depended on reading signals others missed. She noted which families stopped greeting her on the street. She tracked which businesses suddenly closed early when black customers approached. She observed which city officials attended certain lodge meetings and which police officers looked away during confrontations. And she began keeping a record. The idea came to her on a Sunday in early February, during services at Bethel AME Church. Reverend Marcus Toland was preaching on Exodus, the story of Moses and the plagues visited upon Egypt. He spoke about how the oppressor only understands power, how resistance requires both courage and strategy, how liberation is not granted but taken. Ruthie sat in the fourth pew, listening with half her attention while the other half worried over a problem that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She knew the Knights were recruiting. She knew their membership was growing. But she also knew that anonymity was their greatest asset. Men who would not dare commit violence in daylight donned hoods after dark and became anonymous instruments of terror. The hoods protected them from consequences, allowed them to act without accountability, transformed individuals into an undifferentiated mass that could not be prosecuted or shamed. What if the hoods could be removed? Not physically, but through documentation. If names could be attached to actions, if membership could be proven, if the civic mask could be stripped away to reveal the faces underneath, then the entire structure would become vulnerable. Men who committed arson as Knights would become men who committed arson as city councilmen, shop owners, church deacons. Their protection would evaporate. The problem was evidence. The Knights met privately. Their membership rolls were not public. Their rituals were conducted in locked rooms. Proving who belonged required either infiltration or observation, and a black woman could accomplish neither without drawing immediate suspicion and likely violence, unless she was already invisible. Ruthie began with vehicles. The Knights owned automobiles or drove carriages, expensive conveyances that signaled status and could be tracked. She started noting license plate numbers and vehicle descriptions whenever she saw a gathering that might be connected to the organization. Muller's Hardware, where the Knights met, had a parking area visible from the street. Ruthie walked past it 3 evenings per week, always at different times, memorizing the vehicles present. She carried no notebook, made no obvious study, simply walked as if heading elsewhere and committed details to memory. Later, in her small apartment above the butcher shop on Elm Street, she transcribed everything into a ledger purchased from the stationer for 15 cents. Vehicle registrations were public record, maintained by the county clerk. Ruthie visited the courthouse once per week on Saturday mornings when she ostensibly came to town for shopping. The clerk, a young man named Timothy Ross, who treated all visitors with bureaucratic indifference, allowed her to examine the registration logs without question. She matched plate numbers to names, built a roster of vehicle owners who frequented the hardware store on meeting nights. But vehicle ownership alone proved nothing. A man might park near Muller's Hardware for legitimate business. She needed to establish pattern and intent. So she expanded her observations. She noted who attended which church services and cross-referenced that with lodge memberships listed in the social pages of the Portage City Herald. Fraternal organizations published dues amounts and meeting schedules. She visited the library and copied information from the Herald's back issues, building a map of social connections that linked the Knights to other institutions. The Masons, the Elks, the German-American Bund. She talked to widows. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of her work, because it required trust, and trust could be betrayed. But Ruthie had taught the children of these women, had attended funerals for their husbands, had sat with them during illnesses. She was part of the community's fabric. When Dolores Watson's husband died in a foundry accident in January, Ruthie attended the service and brought a casserole. 2 weeks later, she visited again, ostensibly to check on the family. Over coffee, Dolores mentioned her late husband's lodge dues, payments that continued even after his death because the lodge insisted on full-year commitment. She showed Ruthie the receipts, small printed slips bearing the letterhead of the Knights of the White Camellia. "Did he ever speak about the meetings?" Ruthie asked carefully. "Only to say they were for men," Dolores replied. "But he came home angry sometimes. Said they were planning to clean up the city, make it safe for decent folk." She paused. "I think he meant folk like us, not folk like you." "I understand," Ruthie said. And she did. She collected 3 more widow testimonies over the following month. Each woman provided fragments, a name mentioned in passing, a complaint about the cost of regalia, a description of a ritual observed through an accidentally open door. Ruthie wove these fragments into her ledger, building profiles of individual members, establishing hierarchy. She identified the ride captain, the man who led nighttime operations. She identified the treasurer, who collected dues and maintained the organization's modest financial infrastructure. She identified the chaplain, who opened meetings with prayer. By early April, her ledger contained 67 names, each supported by corroborating evidence: vehicle registrations, lodge receipts, witness statements, photographic evidence clipped from newspapers, maps showing routes taken during parades. It was not a legal document. She had no subpoena power, no official standing. But it was comprehensive, detailed, and potentially devastating if placed in the right hands. The question was, whose hands? Ruthie approached Deputy Marcus Freeman on the first Tuesday of April, 1907. Freeman was one of 3 black deputies in Portage City, a former soldier who had served in Cuba during the Spanish War and returned with a medal for valor and a permanent limp from a bullet wound. He worked the overnight shift, patrolling the flats and the industrial district, where most trouble brewed after dark. He was respected by the black community and tolerated by the white establishment, a careful balance he maintained through competence and an awareness of boundaries he could not cross. She found him at the end of his shift, eating breakfast at Rose's Cafe on Elm Street. The cafe served black patrons and a handful of white workers who did not object to integrated seating. Ruthie slid into the booth across from Freeman without invitation. "I have something you need to see," she said quietly. Freeman looked up from his eggs. He was in his 40s, heavy-set, with gray threading through his hair and a permanent wariness in his eyes. "If this is about the school, you need to take it to—" "It's not about the school." Ruthie placed the ledger on the table between them. "It's about the Knights." Freeman's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. "Miss Carter, I would strongly advise you not to involve yourself in matters that could bring you harm. I am already involved. We all are." She pushed the ledger toward him. "Open it." He did. She watched his face as he turned pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something harder. He read for 5 minutes without speaking, then closed the book and looked at her with an intensity that made her spine straighten. "Where did you get this information?" "Public records, observations, testimonies from people who trust me. If these men knew you had this, they don't. Yet." She folded her hands on the table. "I am planning to change that." Freeman leaned back, the booth creaking under his weight. "You're planning to do what exactly?" "Hold a civics lesson at the school, Friday evening. I will invite the parents of my students, members of the community, and I will read from this ledger. I will name names, and I will provide copies of my documentation to any law enforcement officers present who are willing to act on it. They will kill you. Perhaps, but they will have to do it in front of 80 witnesses and 3 deputies." She met his eyes. "I need you there. You and 2 others you trust. Armed, at the back doors." Freeman stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're assuming the district attorney will prosecute." "I am assuming the district attorney cannot ignore evidence presented publicly, in front of witnesses, with documentation that will be copied and distributed. I am assuming that once these men's identities are exposed, they lose their greatest protection." "You're assuming a great deal, Miss Carter. I am assuming that you did not return from Cuba to watch your own people terrorized by cowards in bedsheets." She slid the ledger back toward herself. "Friday, 7 p.m. Will you be there?" The silence stretched. Outside, a delivery wagon rattled past. Someone dropped a plate in the kitchen, the crash followed by laughter. Finally, Freeman nodded once. "I'll bring Henderson and Wright. Both good men, both armed." He leaned forward. "But if this goes wrong, if they come for you afterward, we cannot protect you indefinitely." "I know." Ruthie stood, tucking the ledger under her arm. "Thank you, Deputy Freeman." She left him sitting there, breakfast going cold, staring at the place where the ledger had lain. 3 days to prepare. Ruthie spent Wednesday copying pages from the ledger by hand, making 6 duplicate sets of the most essential documentation. Names, vehicle registrations, photographs, witness statements. She wrapped each set in oilcloth and sealed them with candle wax. Thursday, she distributed invitations to her students to carry home to their parents. A civics lesson. Friday evening, attendance encouraged. She sent a separate note to the editor of the Portage City Herald, Frank Dalton, inviting him to attend an event of significant public interest. She walked the note to his office personally and watched him read it. What kind of event? Dalton asked. He was a thin man in his 50s, hair receding, ink stains on his fingers. One that will provide material for your Saturday edition, Ruthie said. I would recommend bringing a photographer. She did not wait for his response. Friday morning, she arrived at the school 2 hours early. She checked the doors, the windows, the stove. She arranged the chairs in rows, 83 seats, leaving space along the walls for standing room. She placed the lectern at the center of the stage and positioned 3 oil lamps to illuminate it. Then she sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, and waited. They began arriving at 6:30 p.m. Families in their Sunday clothes despite it being Friday, mothers clutching shawls against the April cold, fathers with caps in hand, children unusually quiet. Ruthie greeted each family at the door, shaking hands, directing them to seats. She did not explain what the evening would hold. She had learned that certain plans worked better when participants understood their role only at the moment of execution. By 6:45, 71 people occupied the seats. Others stood along the side walls, elderly men who refused chairs offered by younger attendants, women holding infants. The room smelled of wood smoke and damp wool and the nervous sweat of people who suspected they were about to witness something consequential. Deputy Freeman arrived at 6:50 with 2 other black deputies, Henderson and Wright, both younger men carrying the physical confidence of those who had seen violence and learned to meet it. They positioned themselves at the 3 exits, Freeman at the main rear door, Henderson at the side door near the stage, Wright at the emergency door that opened onto the back field. None of them sat. All 3 kept their coats open, hands near their service revolvers. Frank Dalton arrived at 6:55 with a photographer, a nervous young man named Peter Strauss, who carried a box camera and a satchel of flash powder. Dalton surveyed the room with a journalist's quick assessment, noted the deputies, noted the crowd's composition, noted Ruthie standing alone on the stage. He chose a seat in the 3rd row, slightly left of center, where he could see both the speaker and the audience. Strauss stood against the wall near Freeman, setting up his camera on a tripod. At 6:58, the final attendees filed in. 3 white men in wool coats and bowler hats, none of whom Ruthie recognized. They took seats in the 4th row, center section, and sat with the rigid posture of men attending an execution. One of them wore a ring that caught lamplight, a silver band with an engraved symbol Ruthie had seen before in photographs, the interlocking C's of the white camellia. She recognized the trap closing around her, even as she had constructed it herself. These men had received word of the gathering, had come to observe, to intimidate, possibly to act. Their presence meant the Knights had sources in the black community, informants who had passed along news of the civics lesson. It meant Ruthie's plan was no longer secret, if it ever had been. It meant violence was now a certainty rather than a possibility. Deputy Freeman caught her eye from the back of the room. He gave a small nod. Ready. Ruthie opened her ledger to the first marked page. At precisely 7 p.m. she began. Good evening, Ruthie said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Thank you for attending this civics lesson. Tonight we will discuss a topic that affects every family in this community: the difference between lawful assembly and criminal conspiracy. She let that statement settle. A few people shifted in their seats. The 3 white men in the 4th row did not move. For the past 6 months, an organization calling itself the Knights of the White Camellia has operated in Portage City. This organization claims to represent community values and civic improvement. In reality, It is a criminal enterprise engaged in intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit acts of violence against black residents. She turned a page. I have documented this organization's membership and activities. I will now share that documentation with you and with law enforcement. She began reading names. Harold Muller, owner of Muller's Hardware, 2nd Street. Vehicle registration number Michigan 4732A. Member since September 1906. Treasurer. Present at the cross burning at the Hayes residence, October 14th. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruthie continued. Otto Schreiber, foreman, Portage City Foundry. Vehicle registration Michigan 4911C. Member since August 1906. Ride captain. Leader of the March 16th parade. Witnessed by 3 separate observers wearing distinctive camellia regalia. She read 6 more names, each with vehicle registration, occupation, lodge roll, and documented participation in specific acts. The murmurs grew louder. Several people turned to look at the 3 white men in the 4th row. One of them, the man with the camellia ring, had gone very still. Nathaniel Holt, Ruthie read. City Councilman, Ward 3, member since September 1906, present at meetings on 12 documented occasions. Contributed $20 to the purchase of ceremonial robes. Receipt dated November 3rd. The man with the ring stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the pine floor. This is slander, he said, voice tight with controlled rage. This woman is making false accusations to incite violence against respectable citizens. Ruthie looked at him directly. Sir, I have not accused you of anything. I am simply reading public records and sworn testimony. If you believe any of this information is inaccurate, you are welcome to provide documentation to the contrary. You have no authority. I have evidence. She held up a document. This is a receipt for lodge dues, signed by Harold Muller, treasurer of the Knights of the White Camellia. It lists your name, Councilman Holt, as a member in good standing. Would you like to examine it? Holt's face flushed. He looked toward the back of the room where Freeman stood. Deputy, I demand you arrest this woman for defamation. Freeman did not move. No law against reading public records, Councilman. This is an outrage. This is documentation, Ruthie interrupted. And I have only reached the 12th name on my list. There are 67 in total. Shall I continue? The second white man, younger than Holt, but with the same coiled tension, reached inside his coat. His hand emerged holding a small pistol, nickel-plated, the kind favored by men who had never fired a weapon in anger, but liked the weight of power it provided. Put that book down, he said quietly. Time compressed. The room erupted in motion. Parents grabbed children, pulling them low. Several men stood, blocking the aisle. Deputy Henderson moved toward the stage, hand on his revolver but not yet drawing. Freeman and Wright converged on the armed man from 2 angles. Ruthie did not put the book down. She held it against her chest, exactly as she had that morning, and looked at the man with the pistol. If you fire that weapon, she said, voice calm and clear, you will be committing assault in front of 100 witnesses, including 3 armed deputies and a newspaper editor. You will be arrested. Your name will appear in tomorrow's edition. Your association with the Knights will become public record, and I will still have copies of this ledger distributed to law enforcement and the press. You think you can threaten us? The man's hand shook slightly. Not fear, rage barely contained. I am not threatening you. I am offering you a choice. She took 1 step forward on the stage. You can fire. You will likely hit me. You may kill me, but you will destroy yourself in the process. Or you can sit down, allow me to finish reading, and face whatever legal consequences follow through proper channels." "There will be no legal consequences," the man said. "We run this county." "You did," Ruthie said, "until tonight." The pistol rose, barrel centering on her chest, and Deputy Freeman fired first. The gunshot cracked like lightning in the enclosed space, deafening, followed immediately by screams and the crash of overturning chairs. Freeman's bullet took the armed man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, the nickel-plated pistol flying from his hand to clatter beneath the seats. Henderson was on him before he hit the floor, knee in his back, wrists being cuffed, while the man howled in pain and fury. Wright had drawn on Councilman Holt, who stood frozen with both hands raised. The third white man bolted for the side door, colliding with a family trying to evacuate, sending a woman sprawling. Two fathers blocked his path. He tried to force through and took an elbow to the face that dropped him to his knees, blood streaming from his nose. Freeman moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, securing the injured man's weapon, checking the crowd for additional threats, his own revolver still drawn. "Everyone stay calm," he called out, voice cutting through the panic. "Deputies have the situation controlled. Parents, hold your children. No one leaves until we have statements." Ruthie remained on the stage, still holding the ledger. Her hands were steady. She felt curiously detached, as if watching herself from a great distance. The smell of gunpowder mixed with wood smoke. Someone was crying. A child asked his mother why the man had fallen down. Dalton was on his feet, notebook open, scribbling rapidly. Strauss had his camera aimed at the scene, flash powder ready. "Photograph this," Ruthie heard Dalton tell him. "All of it." The flash ignited twice, illuminating the room in bursts of white light that left after-images floating in the darkness. Once capturing Freeman standing over the wounded man with handcuffs. Once capturing Ruthie on the stage, ledger held high, face set with an expression that would appear in newspapers across 3 states before the week ended. Freeman approached the stage. "Miss Carter, are you injured?" "No." "We need to take statements from everyone present. This will take several hours. I need you to stay here, on the stage, where I can see you." He paused. "They will come for you after this. Tonight, tomorrow, eventually. You understand that?" "I do." "Then why?" "Because someone had to." She opened the ledger again. "Have 55 names left to read, and I have 6 sets of documentation to distribute. 1 for you, 1 for the district attorney, 1 for the Herald, 1 for the county clerk, 1 for the state attorney general, and 1 held in trust by Reverend Toland at Bethel AME." She met his eyes. "This information will not disappear with me. Even if they silence me, the names are now public knowledge." Freeman studied her for a long moment. Then he holstered his weapon and nodded. "Read your list, Miss Carter. I'll keep order." It took 20 minutes to restore calm. Parents settled children in seats or held them in laps. The wounded man was carried to the side room used for storing coal, where Deputy Henderson stood guard. Councilman Holt and the third man were seated in the front row under Wright's supervision, hands cuffed behind their backs. Dalton moved through the crowd collecting names for his story. Strauss took 4 more photographs. When the room had quieted enough for speaking, Ruthie resumed reading. She read all 67 names. Each one received the same treatment: full name, occupation, address, vehicle registration, lodge position if applicable, and documented participation in specific acts. Some entries were brief. Richard Paulson, clerk at First Michigan Bank, member since December 1906, no documented participation in violence, lodge dues paid through March. Others were damning. James Keller, police officer, Portage City Department, member since October 1906, present at 14 meetings, witness turning away from the scene of the Webb grocery vandalism, November 3rd, sworn statement by Marcus Webb. The list included 2 police officers, 1 city councilman, 1 county clerk, 3 shop owners, 2 factory foremen, a postal worker, a teacher at the White Elementary School, and the assistant pastor at St. Mark's Lutheran Church. It included men in their 20s and men in their 60s. It included fathers whose children attended schools in the same district as Ruthie's students. It included men who presented themselves as pillars of the community, lodge brothers, church deacons, men of standing. By the time she reached the final name, it was 9:15 p.m. The room was silent except for the hiss of the oil lamps and the occasional cough. Several women were crying quietly. One man had his head in his hands. The weight of what had been revealed pressed down on everyone present. Not just the roster of names, but the system those names represented. The interlocking network of power that allowed terror to operate openly. The complicity of institutions that should have provided protection. Ruthie closed the ledger. These men have violated Michigan statutes prohibiting criminal conspiracy, assault, arson, and intimidation. They have done so while claiming to uphold community values. They have operated in darkness, protected by silence and fear. Tonight, that protection ends. She descended from the stage and handed the ledger to Freeman, then retrieved the 6 oilcloth-wrapped packets from beneath the lectern. 1 to Freeman, 1 to Dalton. 1 she handed to Reverend Toland, who had arrived during the reading and stood near the back. The remaining 3 she held. Deputy Freeman will take statements from everyone here tonight. I ask that you cooperate fully. Tell him what you have witnessed, what you have experienced, what you know. Your testimony will form the foundation of the legal case against these men. She looked at the crowd, meeting eyes. I know you are afraid. I am afraid too. But fear only works when we allow it to isolate us. When we stand together, when we speak together, we become harder to silence. The first person to stand was Dolores Watson, the widow whose husband's lodge receipts had been among Ruthie's earliest evidence. I'll testify, she said. Whatever you need. Then Marcus Webb stood. I'll testify. Then others. One by one, 15 people volunteered statements, experiences with the Knights, knowledge of activities, willingness to go on record. Freeman took names, promised follow-up interviews, assured them their safety would be prioritized, though everyone in the room understood those were optimistic words rather than guarantees. At 10:40 p.m., Freeman released the crowd. Families filed out into the April night, pulling coats tight against the cold, walking in clusters for safety. Dalton left with his photographer, already mentally composing the story that would occupy the front page of tomorrow's Herald. The 3 captured Knights were loaded into a police wagon that had arrived 20 minutes earlier, driven by a white officer who looked at Freeman with barely concealed contempt, but said nothing. Freeman waited until the last civilian had departed before approaching Ruthie. You cannot go home tonight. They will be waiting for you. I know. Reverend Toland has offered his guest room. His house is next to the church. Stone construction, good sight lines. I will post a deputy outside until the district attorney issues warrants. Will he issue warrants? After tonight? With this documentation? With witnesses? Freeman's expression was grim. He has no choice, but that does not mean the Knights have no allies in the courthouse. This will be a war of documents and lawyers, not just rifles and ropes. It will take time. How much time? Days, weeks, possibly months if they fight hard enough. He placed a hand on her shoulder, brief and fatherly. You opened this door, Miss Carter. Now we have to walk through it. And some of us may not reach the other side. Ruthie nodded. She picked up her coat, her school books, the empty oilcloth wrappings. Then she followed Freeman out into the night, where Wright waited with a carriage to take her to Reverend Tolan's house. Behind them, the schoolhouse stood empty, lamplight still visible through the windows, casting long shadows across the mud. The silence that follows a gunshot is a living thing. District Attorney Thomas Hargrove received his copy of Ruthie's documentation at 11:30 p.m., delivered by Deputy Freeman in person. Hargrove was 52, a Republican who had won his position by narrow margin in the 1904 election and held it through careful management of political alliances and an aversion to controversy. He was not a crusader. He was a pragmatist who understood that careers survived by avoiding cases that split communities down lines of race, class, or partisan loyalty. Freeman spread the documents across Hargrove's desk in the man's home office, where the DA sat in a smoking jacket and house slippers, having been pulled from a late supper with his wife. Hargrove read in silence, occasionally removing his glasses to rub his eyes, then replacing them to read further. When he finished, he looked at Freeman with an expression that mixed anger and resignation. You understand what you are asking me to do. I am asking you to enforce the law. You are asking me to arrest 67 men, many of whom have significant standing in this community, based on evidence collected by a Negro schoolteacher through means that will be challenged in court. The evidence is sound. Vehicle registrations are public record. Lodge receipts are documentary proof of membership. Witness statements are sworn testimony. Photographs place specific individuals at specific locations during criminal acts. Freeman leaned forward. Sir, they fired a weapon tonight in a room full of children, in front of 3 deputies and a newspaper editor. We have the shooter in custody. If you do not act on this, you are signaling that the Knights operate above the law. Hargrove stared at the documents. Outside, a dog barked. A clock chimed midnight. Finally, the DA stood and retrieved his coat from the hall stand. I will issue warrants for the 3 men taken into custody tonight. Assault with a deadly weapon, brandishing, conspiracy. I will review this documentation over the weekend and determine what additional charges can be supported. He put on his coat. But understand, Freeman, this will destroy careers, including possibly mine. And if you do nothing, it will destroy lives, including possibly mine. They looked at each other across the years of uneasy alliance that had allowed a black deputy to serve in a largely white department, the compromises and silences that had kept violence at bay while injustice flourished. Both men knew that balance was ending tonight. Hargrove picked up his telephone and called the county judge's residence. By 1 a.m., arrest warrants had been issued for 14 Knights. The 3 captured at the schoolhouse plus 11 others whose participation in documented criminal acts could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Police officers, roused from sleep, fanned out across Portage City with orders to bring the named men in for questioning. Some went quietly, robed in indignation but compliant. Others barricaded themselves in their homes and had to be extracted with battering rams. 2 fled the city entirely, leaving wives and children behind, vanishing into the network of lodges and safe houses that connected white supremacist organizations across the Midwest. Harold Mueller was arrested at 2:15 a.m. in the back room of his hardware store, where he was discovered burning documents in a potbelly stove. The fire was extinguished. The partially burned papers were recovered and added to evidence. They included membership rolls, meeting minutes, and a ledger detailing expenditures for weapons, robes, and a quantity of kerosene purchased in bulk 3 days before the Hayes Cross burning. Otto Schreiber was arrested at 3 a.m. at his home. He answered the door holding a shotgun, saw 6 officers, and surrendered without resistance. His wife stood in the hallway behind him, silent, holding their infant daughter. Schreiber looked at her once before being led away. "Tell them nothing," he said. She nodded. By dawn, 11 men sat in cells in the county jail. 3 had posted bail within hours, money supplied by lodge brothers who remained free. The others would wait for arraignment Monday morning. The assistant pastor at St. Mark's Lutheran was not arrested because the evidence against him consisted solely of membership, not participation in acts. But his name appeared in Dalton's article, and by Sunday, his resignation would be demanded by his congregation. The Portage City Herald hit the streets at 6 a.m. Saturday morning. The front page carried 2 photographs: Ruthie on the stage holding her ledger, and Freeman standing over the wounded knight with handcuffs. The headline read, "Teachers List Exposes Ku Klux Klan Chapter 67 Named in Conspiracy." Below that, in smaller type, "Deputy fires in defense, 3 arrested, more warrants expected." The article ran to 2 full pages inside, laid out with photographs, reproductions of key documents, and a complete roster of the 67 names. Dalton had written it as straightforward journalism, avoiding editorial comment, allowing the facts to speak. The effect was devastating. By noon, crowds had gathered outside Muller's Hardware, several windows broken. By afternoon, the foundry announced the suspension of Otto Schreiber pending investigation. By evening, Councilman Holt had resigned his position effective immediately. But the Knights were not defeated. They were exposed, which made them more dangerous in different ways. The fire started at Bethel AME Church at 3:30 a.m. Sunday morning. No one saw who set it, though neighbors reported seeing a vehicle with no headlights parked 2 blocks away around 3 a.m. The church was wood frame construction, highly flammable, and by the time the fire brigade arrived at 4:10, the structure was fully engulfed. Reverend Toland stood in the street watching his church burn, holding the oilcloth packet of Ruthie's documentation that he had retrieved from the safe in his office minutes before the roof collapsed. No one was injured. The church was empty at that hour. But the message was clear. Exposure would be met with escalation. Ruthie learned of the fire when Deputy Wright arrived at Toland's house at 4:30, knocking softly so as not to wake the neighborhood. She dressed quickly and came downstairs to find the Reverend sitting at his kitchen table, the oilcloth packet in front of him, face illuminated by a single oil lamp. "I am sorry," Ruthie said. "Don't be." Toland looked at her with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. "They have been burning our churches since Reconstruction. This is not new. What is new is that we have their names. We know who to hold accountable." "Can you prove who set the fire?" "No, but we can prove who benefits from it." He pushed the packet toward her. "This is safe. I gave copies to 3 other ministers before the fire, 1 in Detroit, 1 in Chicago, 1 in Cleveland. This information cannot be burned." Wright spoke from the doorway. "District Attorney wants to see you this morning, Miss Carter. 9 a.m. at his office. He is preparing additional charges." The meeting at Hargrove's office included Ruthie, Freeman, Wright, and 2 prosecutors from the DA's office. Hargrove looked like he had not slept, shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, papers scattered across his desk. He gestured for Ruthie to sit. "Miss Carter, your documentation is comprehensive. It is also legally complex. Defense attorneys will challenge the admissibility of evidence collected without warrant or subpoena. They will argue that witness statements are hearsay. They will claim the lodge receipts prove membership, but not criminal intent." He leaned back in his chair. "I need you to testify, in court. Before a grand jury first, then at trial if we proceed. You will be cross-examined. They will attempt to discredit you, to portray you as a malicious actor with an agenda against white citizens. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes." "They will also attempt to intimidate you. The fire at Reverend Toland's church is only the beginning. We cannot guarantee your safety indefinitely." "I understand." Hargrove studied her. "Why are you doing this? You could have remained silent. You could have left Portage City like other families did. Why take this risk?" Ruthie considered the question. Outside, church bells rang 9 a.m. She thought about her students, the ones who had left and the ones who remained. She thought about the children who would come after, who would live in whatever world she and others built or failed to build. "Because silence is a choice," she said. "And I chose differently." Hargrove nodded. "The grand jury convenes Tuesday. Be prepared to spend the entire day testifying. Bring your original ledger and any additional documentation you have. We will provide protection." He glanced at Freeman. "Deputy Freeman will remain assigned to your security until further notice." Sunday brought new violence. Marcus Webb's grocery was firebombed at 11 p.m. The building did not burn completely due to a passing night watchman who sounded alarm, but the interior was gutted. Webb stood outside in the street, watching smoke pour from the shattered windows, his shotgun hanging loose in one hand. "They want me ruined," he said to no one in particular. "Well, I am insured. I will rebuild." But insurance required paperwork, and paperwork required clerks, and clerks included Richard Paulson at First Michigan Bank, whose name appeared on Ruthie's list. Paulson processed Webb's claim Monday morning, then rejected it Tuesday on grounds of suspicious circumstances suggesting possible fraud. Webb appealed. The appeal was denied by a supervisor whose brother-in-law was Otto Schreiber. Monday brought legal counterattacks. Defense attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming Ruthie's documentation was obtained through illegal surveillance. They filed motions to dismiss charges on grounds of insufficient evidence. They filed motions to recuse Judge Harrison Mills, claiming bias because Mills had once donated to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. All motions were denied, but they accomplished their purpose: delay and publicity. The Knights also launched a newspaper campaign. The Portage City Patriot, a smaller weekly paper known for nativist editorial positions, ran a front-page editorial titled, "Negro Teachers' False Accusations Threaten Community Harmony." It portrayed Ruthie as a troublemaker, an agitator imported from radical institutions like Oberlin to sow discord between races. It claimed her documentation was fabricated, her witnesses coerced, her entire presentation a calculated attempt to undermine white authority. Letters to the editor flooded both papers. Some supported Ruthie, praising her courage and calling for full prosecution. Others condemned her in language that ranged from paternalistic concern to outright threats. "This woman has overstepped her place," one letter read. "If the law does not correct her impertinence, the community will find other means." Tuesday morning, Ruthie testified before the grand jury. The proceeding was closed to the public, conducted in a windowless room in the courthouse basement. 12 jurors, all male, all white, watched as she presented her evidence. She spoke for 4 hours, interrupted frequently by questions from the prosecutors and occasional objections from defense attorneys present to observe. The lead defense attorney, a man named Carlisle who represented Councilman Holt, was particularly aggressive. He questioned Ruthie's motives, her methods, her credibility. "Miss Carter, is it true you have previously expressed animosity toward white residents of Portage City?" "I have expressed concern about criminal activity targeting black residents." "That was not my question. Have you ever made statements critical of white people in general?" "I have made statements critical of specific individuals engaged in specific criminal acts." "Would you describe yourself as an advocate for Negro advancement?" "I would describe myself as an educator. An educator who took it upon herself to conduct surveillance, collect private information, and publicly accuse respected citizens of serious crimes. An educator who documented criminal conspiracy and provided evidence to law enforcement, which is both lawful and appropriate." The exchange continued in this vein for 90 minutes. Carlisle attempted to portray Ruthie as biased, vengeful, operating outside legal boundaries. She responded with precision, refusing to be drawn into emotional responses, citing specific statutes and precedents she had researched at the library. By the end, several jurors appeared frustrated with Carlisle's tactics. One interrupted to ask Ruthie directly, "Miss Carter, do you have personal knowledge of any violence committed by the named individuals?" "I have documented their presence at meetings where violence was planned. I have witness statements describing their participation. I have physical evidence linking them to specific acts. What I do not have is first-hand observation of the acts themselves, because I am not suicidal enough to attend a Klan meeting." Scattered laughter from the jury. Carlisle objected. The objection was overruled. The grand jury deliberated for 2 hours. At 4 p.m. Tuesday, they returned indictments against 23 knights on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit arson to criminal intimidation to assault. Warrants were issued. By Wednesday morning, another 12 men sat in county jail cells. The Portage City establishment split along lines that surprised everyone. The mayor, a Democrat who had maintained studied neutrality on racial issues, called for the Knights to disband and issued a statement condemning extra-legal organizations that undermine civil order. The Foundry management announced a zero-tolerance policy for employees involved in organizations promoting racial violence and suspended 3 workers pending investigation. St. Mark's Lutheran and 2 other churches issued joint statement distancing themselves from the Knights and calling for Christian charity and lawful resolution of community tensions. But other institutions defended the Knights or remained silent. The Masons issued no statement. The Elks issued no statement. The German-American Bund published an editorial arguing that the Knights were being persecuted for legitimate political expression. Several shops downtown posted signs reading, "We stand with our brothers," understood by all as declarations of Knight sympathy. The black community mobilized. Bethel AME held outdoor services Sunday in the ruins of their burned church. Nearly 200 people gathered in defiance of implied threats. Collections were taken for rebuilding. Ministers from Detroit and Chicago visited to offer support and connect Portage City's struggle to the broader movement for civil rights gaining momentum across northern states. What would you do if your church burned, your business was destroyed, your children were threatened, all for the crime of seeking equal protection under law? Would you leave? Would you stay and fight? The people of Portage City's Flats neighborhood asked themselves these questions daily, and their answers varied. Some families packed belongings and departed for Detroit or Chicago. Others dug in, fortified homes, organized neighborhood watches. The community was fracturing under pressure, which was precisely what the Knights intended. Ruthie continued teaching. Lakewood School reopened Monday despite threats, though enrollment had dropped to 38 students. Parents who kept their children home cited fear of retaliation. Those who sent them did so with visible anxiety, arriving early each morning to walk children inside, lingering at the door. Ruthie taught through it all, maintaining the rhythm of lessons and recitations, creating islands of normalcy in a sea of chaos. Thursday afternoon, she received a visitor during the lunch recess, a white woman in her 40s, well-dressed, driving a new Ford automobile. She introduced herself as Eleanor Schreiber, Otto's wife. "May I speak with you privately, Miss Carter?" Ruthie led her to the small office at the back of the schoolhouse. Eleanor sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, clearly uncomfortable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "My husband participated in things he should not have participated in. I did not stop him. I am complicit." Ruthie waited. "He told me it was about protecting jobs, about preserving our way of life. I believed him because it was easier than confronting what he was truly doing." Eleanor looked at Ruthie directly. "You have children in your school who will grow up in this county. So do I. I do not want them growing up in a place where terror is tolerated. I am here to offer testimony." "Against your husband?" "Against the Knights. I have access to documents Otto kept at home, meeting minutes, financial records, communications with other lodges in Michigan and Indiana." She pulled a folded envelope from her purse. "This is an inventory of what I can provide. In exchange, I ask for one thing: protection for my children. They should not suffer for their father's choices." Ruthie accepted the envelope. "I cannot guarantee protection, but I will ensure the district attorney knows what you are offering." Eleanor nodded. "That will have to be sufficient." She stood. "You were brave to do what you did, Miss Carter. I am attempting to be brave now, in a much smaller way. I hope it is enough." After she left, Ruthie opened the envelope. The inventory listed 47 documents, including correspondence between Otto Schreiber and Knights chapters in 5 states discussing coordination of enforcement actions, financial records showing thousands of dollars moving between lodges, and photographs of ceremonies that clearly depicted illegal weapons caches. She walked the envelope to the courthouse that afternoon and delivered it personally to Thomas Hargrove. The first trial opened on May 7, 1907. People vs. Nathaniel Holt, charged with conspiracy to commit arson and criminal intimidation. The courtroom was packed, spectators arriving hours early to claim seats. Judge Mills implemented strict security. Deputies at every entrance, bags searched, weapons confiscated. The gallery was segregated by custom but not by law. Black observers on the left, white on the right, an invisible line neither group crossed. Hargrove prosecuted personally, a signal that the DA's office was committed despite political risk. His opening statement was precise and factual, walking the jury through the evidence. Vehicle registrations placing Holt at Muller's Hardware on meeting nights. Lodge receipts bearing his signature. Witness testimony describing his participation in planning sessions, and a sworn statement from Eleanor Schreiber detailing conversations where Holt discussed targets for intimidation. The defense attorney Carlisle countered by attacking Ruthie's credibility. He portrayed her as an outsider with radical leanings, trained at Oberlin, which he emphasized with disdain, motivated by racial resentment rather than civic duty. He argued that lodge membership was not criminal, that planning discussions were hypothetical, that no evidence directly linked Holt to any specific violent act. Ruthie testified on the trial's second day. She spent 6 hours on the stand, first under direct examination by Hargrove, then under cross-examination by Carlisle. The experience was grueling. Carlisle attempted to trap her in contradictions, to make her angry, to expose bias. She remained calm, answering each question with measured precision, referring to her ledger when necessary, never rising to the bait. "Miss Carter, do you hate white people?" "No." "Do you believe white people are inherently racist?" "I believe systems can be racist regardless of individual intent." "That was not my question." "Then please clarify your question." The jury watched this exchange closely. Several appeared annoyed with Carlisle's tactics. After 2 hours, Judge Mills intervened. "Counselor, if you have substantive questions regarding the evidence, proceed. Otherwise, move on." Eleanor Schreiber testified on day 3. Her appearance caused a stir. Women from St. Mark's Lutheran sat in the gallery, some glaring at her, others appearing sympathetic. She described Otto's involvement with the Knights in clinical detail, holding nothing back. She produced documents from her purse, meeting minutes in Otto's handwriting, financial records showing his contributions, a photograph of him in regalia standing with Holt and Mueller. Carlisle tried to discredit her as a scorned wife seeking revenge, but Eleanor's demeanor, calm and sorrowful rather than angry, undermined that narrative. "I am not here because I hate my husband," she said. "I am here because I love my children and want them to inherit a better community than this one has become." The trial concluded after 5 days. Jury deliberation lasted 11 hours. The verdict, guilty on both counts. Sentencing was scheduled for June 1st. Holt would face up to 5 years in prison. The second trial began immediately. People v. Otto Schreiber. Similar evidence, similar structure, similar outcome. Guilty. 3 years. By the end of May, 8 Knights had been convicted. 6 remained in pretrial detention fighting charges. 3 had fled the jurisdiction and were subjects of warrants. The remainder, those against whom evidence was insufficient for criminal conviction, faced civil consequences: job loss, social ostracism, families that disintegrated under pressure. Harold Mueller closed his hardware store on May 30th and departed Portage City for parts unknown. The building stood empty for 2 years before being purchased by a Jewish merchant who converted it into a clothing shop. The back room where the Knights had met was walled off and eventually forgotten. The Knights of the White Camellia as an organization ceased to exist in Portage City. Individual members remained, nursing grievances, but the lodge infrastructure collapsed. Without meetings, without leadership, without the protective anonymity of the hood, the Knights could not function. They became a scattered collection of angry men rather than an organized terror network. But hatred does not evaporate with conviction. It finds new forms. The violence came in smaller acts now, individual rather than organized. Ruthie's apartment was burglarized in June. Nothing valuable was taken, but her belongings were destroyed, furniture overturned, clothes shredded, a message left in paint on the wall: "You will pay." She moved into a room at Bethel AME's rebuilt parish house, which had risen from the ashes of the church with donations from across the state. Marcus Webb's Grocery reopened in August with loans from Black-owned banks in Detroit. The insurance battle was eventually resolved through legal action, but the delay cost him months of business. Several white customers who had patronized him before the Troubles refused to return. "I buy from my own kind," one said. Webb survived by expanding delivery services to the flats and cultivating relationships with black customers who appreciated his refusal to be driven out. Deputy Freeman was passed over for promotion to sergeant in July. The stated reason was administrative restructuring. The actual reason was never articulated, but understood by all. He continued working overnight patrols in the flats, protecting a community that appreciated him even as the department marginalized him. He would retire in 1920 with full pension, having served 28 years. His obituary in 1934 would make no mention of the night. He fired in defense of a teacher reading names. Frank Dalton won the Michigan Press Association's award for investigative journalism in 1907 for his coverage of the night's exposure. His career flourished. The Herald's circulation increased by 30%. He would go on to expose corruption in the state legislature, document labor abuses in Detroit factories, and become one of Michigan's most respected editors. He never forgot the woman who handed him the story that made his reputation. Eleanor Schreiber divorced Otto in 1908 on grounds of moral turpitude. She moved to Chicago with her children and remarried in 1910. Her children grew up never knowing their father's full history, told only that he had made mistakes and paid for them. Eleanor worked as a bookkeeper and lived quietly. Her active testimony a secret she carried until her death in 1941. Otto Schreiber served 2 years of his sentence at Jackson State Prison. He was released in 1909 and disappeared from public record. Some accounts place him in California, working under an assumed name. Others suggest he died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. His fate remains uncertain. Nathaniel Holt served 3 years at Jackson. Upon release, he attempted to resurrect his political career in Ohio but failed. He died in 1922 of a heart attack, largely forgotten by a community that had once celebrated him as a civic leader. The Knights of the White Camellia attempted to reconstitute in Portage City in 1912, but the organization never regained traction. Too many people remembered. Too many documents were still on file. The names could not be scrubbed from the public record, and without anonymity, the Knights had no power. Later iterations of the Klan in Michigan during the 1920s would find greater success in other cities, but Portage City remained inhospitable ground. Ruthie Carter taught at Lakewood School until 1923, when the county integrated its school system and she was offered a position at the consolidated Portage City Middle School. She taught there until her retirement in 1947, educating 2 generations of students, black and white, with the same precision and care she had demonstrated that April night. She never married. She never left Portage City. When asked why she stayed in a place that had tried to destroy her, she replied simply, "Because this is my home. I do not abandon my home to people who seek to ruin it." The original ledger, the small oilcloth-bound book that contained 67 names and changed a county's trajectory, was donated to the Burton Historical Collection in Detroit upon Ruthie's death in 1961. It remains there today, preserved behind glass, a testament to what documentation and courage can accomplish. Researchers occasionally request access. They turn the pages carefully, reading entries in Ruthie's precise handwriting, studying the vehicle registrations and lodge receipts, examining the witness statements that were once life-threatening secrets and are now historical artifacts. The ledger is less than 100 pages. It weighs perhaps 12 ounces. It was compiled by one woman over a period of 4 months, using only public records and testimony freely given. It destroyed an organization that had terrorized a community and appeared untouchable. It demonstrated that power built on anonymity collapses when names are spoken aloud. The story of Ruthie Carter's list spread beyond Portage City. Civil rights organizations in the early 20th century studied her methods, understanding that exposure of membership could be as effective as legal prosecution. During the 1950s and 60s, activists facing revived Klan organizations would employ similar tactics, documenting license plates, collecting testimonies, publishing names. The strategy had been proven in 1907 in a small Michigan town by a teacher who understood that sunlight was the best disinfectant. Lakewood School still stands, though it has been converted to a community center. A plaque was installed in 1997, 90 years after the civics lesson, commemorating the events of April 9th. The text is simple. On this site, Principal Ruthie Carter exposed the Knights of the White Camellia through documentation and courage, demonstrating that ordinary citizens can hold power accountable. Her list changed a county. But the deepest legacy is not in plaques or archives. It is in the families who remained in Portage City, who built lives and businesses and communities because someone stood on a stage and read names until the silence broke. It is in the understanding that documentation matters, that speaking truth carries cost, but silence carries greater cost, that systems of oppression persist only when no one challenges them publicly. It is in knowing that sometimes a ledger smaller than a hymnal can bring down an empire of hatred. On certain April evenings, when the ice still clings to the eaves despite the calendar's promise of spring, people walking past what used to be Lakewood School report hearing a woman's voice reading names aloud, each one clear and precise, echoing from a building that now houses senior programming and youth basketball leagues. The voice is never quite loud enough to make out the words, never quite present enough to locate its source. It is simply there, reciting, documenting, refusing to let history be forgotten or revised. The Burton Historical Collection receives approximately 12 requests per year to view Ruthie Carter's ledger. Researchers study it for academic papers on resistance movements. Activists consult it for practical strategies. Descendants of the named knights occasionally request access, seeking to understand how their grandfathers and great-grandfathers could have participated in such organized cruelty. The ledger answers no questions about human nature. It simply records what happened when documentation met courage on a cold April night in 1907, when one woman decided that silence was a choice she refused to make. And in the margin of the ledger's final page, in Ruthie's handwriting, is a note she added years later when donating the book to the archives. They believed their names would protect them. I believed their names would expose them. I was correct. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.